Hey, it's Jesko from AcousticsInsider.com, which is all about acoustic treatment techniques for home and project studios that actually work without all that voodoo. And what I want to talk to you about today is a simple mistake that I often see people making when they're trying to judge the low end in their room. And it's simple enough to make. I used to make it as well. And I think it all stems from our expectations about what acoustics can do for us and what it actually means to have a good low end, right? What I'm talking about is expecting that in a treated room, the bass sounds the same everywhere. Now, I think this is a natural expectation. Like if you've ever judged or tried to figure out the low end in your room, and you've maybe played some sine waves or played some music, and then you've moved around your room and you've noticed, wow, it really changes. Like the amount of low end that you get in one spot is completely different to what you get in another spot, and you might have like strong resonances in certain locations, and you would expect, sure, that this goes away with treatment, right? In fact, you would kind of want that, because if you're sitting there mixing a song and you're trying to judge between the kick and the bass and you're moving your head around all the time, surely you must have a sound that doesn't change, right? So this is actually a misconception, because what you'll find is that even in the most well-treated studios, the most high-end studios, you can't get bass that sounds the same everywhere. It's a bit counterintuitive. Let me explain. So when I first noticed this, or when I was first made aware of this, I was actually visiting Northwood Acoustics at their headquarters in Brussels, in Belgium, just outside of Brussels, actually. Great time. Spent a few hours there with Thomas Jean-Jean. It was really fun, really interesting, checking out the room, obviously nerding away with him. And I remember he at some point when we were kind of listening in the control room, and he showed me what things sounded like. I played some mixes that I'd done myself, and so I cheekily started moving around the room, trying to check, does the bass actually, like, did he actually manage to fix the bass? You know, does it actually sound the same everywhere? So I could start like walking around the perimeter of the room, cheekily like listening here and there, having a stop here and a stop there. And he's just kind of standing in the middle of the room watching me. And at some point he goes, "What are you doing?" And I'm just like, "I just wanted to check if the bass changes as I move along the room." And he's just like, "Yeah, of course it does. It's never going to go away." And I was just like, "What?" And then he explained it to me, and it's so obvious, and I felt like such a noob. And that's what I want to show you today. So it all comes down to the fact that we're actually listening with two speakers, right? And if you've got two speakers playing the same sound, you'll get interference between those speakers, which will create a comb filter. And the frequency, or the first notch of that comb filter, will depend on the path differences between the two speakers, right? So especially if you're moving further away from your speakers, or further to one side rather, then that path difference can be quite long. And so that notch in the comb filter will be in the lows, in the very deep frequencies. And obviously as you move, so will that difference in path, and so that notch in the comb filter will move, which will sound like the bass changing as you move. And so as long as you use two speakers, this is never going to go away. Unless you obviously listen in mono, but with one speaker. But for most of us, that's just not the case, right? So the other particular case that also causes the same effect is the floor reflection. So even in the most well-treated studio, the floor reflection is pretty much impossible to get rid of, especially if you're further away from the speakers. So you'll always have that direct sound, you'll always have that floor reflection, which causes a comb filter, which causes a dip in the low frequencies. And as you move further away and closer to the speakers, that path difference will change. and you'll get a changing frequency of the comb filter, which will sound like the bass is changing, like the volume or the amplitude and the tonality of the bass is changing. So even in the most well-treated studio, that effect of the bass changing as you walk across your room is never going to go away. What you can expect to go away is the contribution that standing waves make to this perception, right? And that's something you definitely want to get rid of. But what you can't expect is that the bass just evens out everywhere when you walk across your room. It just doesn't happen, right? But so if we can't rely on a significant improvement in how the bass evens out as we walk across the room, with the more treatment that we do, what ways do we still have to test the quality of our low end? I mean, before we used to just put on some music and walk around and then hear that difference and say, oh yeah, this room has a big low end problem. But if that problem remains, no matter what other options do we have to figure out how big our low end problem actually is? Now, sure, you could say do measurements, right? But if you followed me for a while, you've probably heard me say that I don't actually recommend starting off with measurements. They're not easy to do by any means, and they're definitely not simple to interpret, and that it's quite a long-winded process, and it usually leads to more confusion than actually answering any questions that you have. So instead, I think you should do a structured listening test. This is what I developed the Basshunter technique for. It's a simple way and a quick way for you to assess what standing waves in particular are actually doing to the low end in your room. It'll help you hear and feel what the low end is actually doing without having to rely on complicated measurements. The great thing is you can use it for like a multitude of things. And the first one being just figuring out where the best spot with the most even low end balance is in your room, which is the spot where you should ultimately place your listening position, your sweet spot, which evens out or gives you the best kind of starting point for getting a good low end in your room. But it'll also help you figure out which direction you should be facing in your room. Should you really be facing the short side? Should you maybe be facing the long side after all, right? And how far away from that front wall is the ideal spot that gives you that best low end balance. And usually you have that thumb rule in a square room to follow, to place your listening position at about 38% of the length of the room. But in my experience, that doesn't always work out because there are so many things that affect the actual standing wave pattern in your room that you can't rely on the maths to find that perfect spot. And sometimes a few inches, a few centimeters can make a whole lot of difference. So that's what this test helps you figure out. Where exactly is that spot? And if you're setting up a new studio and setting up in a new room, which direction should you face? Which direction is your starting point to get good sound? On top of that, obviously, it works great in asymmetrical rooms. And that's really the big advantage of this test, because if you've got an L-shaped room, or if you've got slanted ceilings like in an attic, or just like angled walls, some sort of weird asymmetrical shape, then all of the maths, all of those models, they just fall out the window really quickly anyway. So you need a different approach to figure out where you should be setting up. And that's where this test is really, really strong and really useful. So I've prepared a PDF that guides you through this process in the description, and there's a link you can download that. And that's really what I want you to take away here and what I want you to do now. If you are trying to assess whether you have a low-end problem in your room, I want you to download the PDF for the Basshunter technique, go through the procedure, and first of all, just figure out what standing waves are actually doing in your room and what that tells you about how you should start using the space, where you set up, where that spot for the best low end balance is, and how to start a procedure on which to build on with proper treatment. All right, that's it for now. Again, I hope that helped. I hope you learned something here. Remember that if you test your room, don't just blindly expect that your bass will even out with treatment, or the other way around. Don't just go in a room, play some music, walk around and then say, well, this room has a low end problem. They all have low end problems. Yes, it's true. It doesn't really tell you anything unless you do a proper structured listening test that isolates the standing wave problem from the fact that you're using two speakers and the fact that you have a floor reflection, which will contribute to this imbalance. I'll see you in the next one. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.